generally speaking, what tends to happen anyway, even when we do have a topic to discuss, it tends to meander all over the place anyway, and that's kind of how I like it.
The better conversations go that way, I think so.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm currently doing another one of these things. It's sort of a new venture, a joint venture with Kit Power, fellow writer, and we've done a couple of different podcasts and whatnot, and it just naturally tends to gravitate towards input and influence. So what media experiences have shaped the natures of our imaginations and of our psyches and whatnot. So we're doing a podcast called "What the Hell Is Wrong with Us."
That's a good title.
We thought about it, and one of the things we did think about was doing a sort of portmanteau title called "Strange Power," which would have been quite fun, as in these things exercise a strange power over us. But I thought that was a bit too punny.
I mean, Utopia is full of puns, so I'm partial to them. The whole genre starts on a pun, so it's
right. Okie dokes. So I will anneal myself against imminent pain when it comes to puns. But yeah, it's we started. I think we did one last week. It's just been uploaded but unlisted on Weaveworld. Which obviously is a massive one for me. It's just the text. It's just we were talking for about 4 hours. It was ridiculous.
I think the one I didn't listen to all of it because I ran out of time. But the one you did with The Binding of Isaac goes on for about 3.5 hours or something like that.
Yes, and that was late at night as well. I mean, Kit's schedule is such that. He tends to only have free time of an evening. He's not only a writer, he also works, he also has a family, so it's very, very hard to balance these things. So, yes, that one was going on into the wee hours of the morning.
Which is appropriate for the game.
Oh, my God, yeah. Well, it as we discussed on the podcast, it's an infinite game. I've pretty much exhausted most of the discoveries in it at this point, or so I believe. But I still go back to it all the time. In fact, I discovered in the videos I uploaded recently to the Exaggerated Elegy channel that the latest update has all sorts of new stuff in it.
That's one of the fantastic ways the game is set up, that it's easy for them to do that and to constantly update it. In a much better way than Word and Skype.
Oh my goodness, yes, absolutely. I mean, I just love the fact that this game has proven so phenomenally popular, and it has such a rabidly dedicated fan base, which of course it does, that they are still introducing these significant updates, where it's not just fixing bugs, it's not just smoothing over little problems, they're actually introducing new content into it. I mean, I ran up against a boss encounter in it recently that I have never come across before, and it sort of startled me a little bit, and of course as a result I died. But I was still very pleased. I was still very pleased with the experience.
Yeah, I remember when I played it, I started playing it obsessively when I came to London, because I had huge amounts of trap time in between moving, and we were sort of staying in hotels and
of course.
And I also got phenomenally ill, as I've discovered. Moving from the country to the city, you go from like once every 3 years illness to once every year illness.
Of course, yes.
And so it was a really strange experience, sort of trap time, being completely displaced and completely out of my head in illness, and then playing
so
this
slightly
game.
addled frame of mind.
Yes, yeah.
Good frame of mind for playing The Binding of Isaac, actually. For engaging with that symbolism, definitely.
That kind of frame of mind, I think it can often turn even terrible things into quite interesting experiences. I remember once when I was very ill, I watched, I think, 2 entire seasons of the show Nip Tuck, and I had a memory of it that was so vastly different to the actual show that it's sort of incomprehensible. I would almost want to like recreate my memory of Nip Tuck whilst chugging Lucozade in a state of delirium rather than...
Oh, that's superb though, isn't it? I mean, this in and of itself is a fascinating subject for me. I love those experiences where you are in a different frame of mind, where you consume something and get a distorted perspective of it, which is removed from the reality. When you go back to experience it again, it's a totally different thing. It's a totally different artifact. So you've, on the interplay between your interpretation and whatever bizarre adult thing you're projecting onto it and the actual artifact, you're creating something else. You're creating a kind of surreal art.
Yes, absolutely, and I think that's one of the things I like about. I mean, if you think about things like The Binding of Isaac and those kinds of user-generated experiences, they have an acknowledgement of that's quite unusual. It's something quite unique to the medium of video game playing, especially where they have a setup so you can create your own narrative in the game. It's very geared to, in literary speak, sort of a reader-orientated experience.
Absolutely, and it seems to be something that's becoming increasingly popular in video games of late. It was something that was relegated almost exclusively to the independent market. Up until very recently, now that some of the more mainstream producers are actually taking notice of those trends, we of course had things like the Dark Souls, Bloodborne, which are comprised entirely of that phenomena. They have next to no story outside of that.
And it's all user generated.
It's wonderful.
Yeah.
It's absolutely wonderful because it means that every single person who engages with those games is having their own experience. They're producing this wonderful, unique child as a result of whatever biases and assumptions that they're bringing to whatever their interpretations are of what's happening. It's wonderful.
And it escapes some of the more inane questions around video games, like the endless is it or isn't it art, which is sort of a boring, and then just kind of goes into what is unique about this medium, aside from any technical questions.
Who cares? There is an innate snobbery, isn't there? There's an innate sort of status of privilege and condescension in question, surely, that these traditional mediums, well, they can be considered art for whatever reason, but video games are, because of course it is still a relatively new medium, it's relatively young, and of course it's a medium that's still largely it largely has significance for younger audiences. We haven't reached that point yet, although I do know a couple of octogenarian video game players who think it's fantastic. We haven't yet quite reached that point where we have entire elderly generations who are playing video games. There seems to be the whole phenomena, the sort of denigration of video games, the assumption, and it's assumed in our discourses, if you look at how video games are referenced in, say, news media or whatever, not only is it massively ill-informed, they tend to have a perspective on video games that is at least a decade behind what's actually happening. You also have a situation whereby they talk about video games in terms where they're not actually referring to video games. It's euphemistic. What they're actually doing is they are deliberately obscuring a kind of a paedophobia. It's a kind of enshrined denigration of the young.
Yes, and I think that it kind of moves with a general way in which mediums go through these phases, and it's exactly the same if you look at the emergence of the novel, from denigration to a sort of I think for a long time you see this in all books. You see this referenced in things like Madame Bovary and in Anna Karenina. It's the indulgence of upper class women, the novel, and it has no value, and there's a lot of sort of misogyny attached to that. And then it goes towards acceptance, and then everyone starts prophesizing its death, so you get the sort of early death of the novel about 200 years ago. It's still sort of constant. I think Will Self actually sort of every 2 years predicts the death of the novel. He's been doing that sort of as a running thing.
So it's almost become almost self-parodic at this point, I imagine.
I think with video games, with anime as well. I mean, I think you're tracking that slow acceptance into the mainstream. You read Guardian reviews of things like Studio Ghibli. I remember they did a hilariously laughable review. That's a bit redundant, hilariously laughable. Where they talked about one of his newer films. I can't remember which one. It's about an airplane event, or it's one of his less brilliant films in my view, as the greatest of all of his works, without really seeming to know any of the Studio Ghibli back catalogue at all, or any of the rest of anime outside of just
this one thing that they've seen. Right. So, yeah, that's that seems to be a general thing that happens there, doesn't it? In popular mediums, not just in news media, but in I think soaps are a fantastic example. Soaps are a wonderful sort of encapsulation of this very phenomena, in that whenever they reference something that's happening in culture, it's often something that has happened and has been dealt with in far more complex and ambiguous and legitimate ways about half a decade beforehand. I often find that when they do try to reference cultural phenomena or political phenomena, it's as I say, it's half a decade too late, and also in highly simplistic terms. So if you get, for example, just pertinent to my own demographics, if you get the gay characters in soap operas, they often have the gay storylines attached to them, and they are often very trite, and they are often very stereotypical, and they are massively dehumanizing, but they're also safe.
This is a tendency for anything that tends to be topical. I think you can see, if you look at those, I generally don't agree with the category of universal art. I think when we characterize something as universal, it's usually because it's old, but it still connects to issues that are pertinent. So, for example, when we say Shakespeare is universal, we usually mean, well, actually those early modern considerations that were problems for him that he was trying to work through are actually still very much problems for a lot of us that we're still trying to work through. But with topical art, it usually tries to and misses that attempt to be universal by focusing on something that's very trite and very limited. And you could see that with the way that some things date incredibly poorly. And South Park is a really good example.
Oh, South Park is a fantastic example. And I imagine that's also as a result just of the nature of the thing itself, because it's been running for so long. It's just because of its own longevity. Of course, and of course, The Simpsons is a...
Yeah, because they really want to be hyper relevant, and so by focusing on ephemera, they kind of seem so dated. Even just a year or 2 years later, it can seem shocking how quickly they date.
Of course, and it's also because they are establishment now. There quite likely was a time when the likes of The Simpsons and South Park, yes, they were deviant and they were transgressive and they were counterculture at one time, but that has stopped. And it has stopped for a very long time at this point. They have become the establishment, and they therefore have investment. There is investment in them, so they can't really comment too much one way or the other, certainly not outside of culturally enshrined norms.
And if they do, it's always painfully awkward and semi-apologetic, and it usually falls flat on its face.
I haven't sat down and actually watched The Simpsons for a very long time. But occasionally I will. I generally don't watch television anyway because I just powerfully dislike it. But when I'm at work, often one of my service users may be watching The Simpsons or something to that effect, and I will catch it, and I have never seen a show before that is so painfully and awkwardly aware of its illegitimacy, of a show that actually screams at its audience, "Kill me." Please kill me.
It's the worst of nostalgia aesthetics, and I think there's a need to differentiate between potential. I mean, look, for example, the revival of Games Workshop stuff does nostalgia really well because it attempts to surpass what it was, whilst at the same time acknowledging it, and it's grounded in that duality between the thing that it used to be and the thing that it has to become. Whereas that kind of constantly looking back on itself and trying to stay true to some platonic form of itself. It's just catastrophic.
It's a huge mistake, isn't it? It's a huge mistake for not only for the medium itself, for the art itself, but also the audience aren't there anymore. They have moved on. They have consumed what you had to tell them in that particular state, and they've become something new. They've become something other, and they should demand something other.
And the worst symptom of this, I think, I just watching today your, I think it was one of your more recent videos on the Strange Playground podcast about memory. And I think the worst symptom of this is that by presenting a very accurate and blunt version of the past, you actually confront your audience with the discrepancy between their memories of how it was before and the reality of how it was before. And of course, you can't really bring up all of the rich associations that your audience actually attaches to what you used to produce. So
of course, the lightning in the bottle, it cannot be recaptured. It simply cannot be recaptured. But for, in a very real sense, the entities that experienced that thing, that phenomena, don't exist anymore. In a very real sense, they have transformed, they have elaborated, they've murdered themselves and moved on. And it does seem that there is a particularly poisonous species of nostalgia taking root in a lot of Anglophonic culture at the moment, and it seems to be infesting every element of our discourses, of our media. It's prevalent within our news media. In fact, within our news media, I would say it's simply assumed. There are just certain narratives. They don't even have to reference them directly. They just assume them and provide their viewers with reinforcement of those narratives, and that's it. That seems to be it, without any legitimate attempt to question them.
Presuppositional, absolutely.
Yeah, and therefore is powerfully insidious, because it has a taming effect on the audience as well. It gives you this sense that everything is okay, everything's all right, everything is as it has been and forever will be, as though everything is monolithic and change never happens, which of course we know it does. We know it does from very recent history. It's powerfully distressing to me. I see it very much. I mean, you used Games Workshop as an example earlier of how to do it well, and I totally agree. That is exactly how you do it well. The reason being, it evokes the aesthetics of the past, and therefore very cleverly evokes it leaves it to its audience to apply whatever associations they have with this particular image or that particular miniature or whatever, and then it also simultaneously moves the context of that image on.
It keeps the sort of rich vein of associations, which is exactly why it was popular in the past, open and allows for that. And it also, I think, provides a certain level of closure, which is another thing that's denied by nostalgia culture. And I see commercialism as antithetical to closure in any form, because of course the whole point is to keep as many things constantly going,
of course,
in a sort of half-dead sense, and that is it's incredibly damaging to art. I think that the loss of endings, especially in popular fiction, has been pronounced.
But it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I'm quite immersed in popular culture. As I believe you are. I mean, I'm a huge fan of cartoons and of anything to that effect: films, cinema, video games, novels. And I'm just a rabid consumer of this material, and that you can almost taste the poison. It's amazing, isn't it? You can almost feel it. I think when you're particularly attuned to this subject matter, when you consume it as a matter of your being, as a matter of your course, you can almost taste it. I see it very much in reactions to things, like, for example, if there's a new version of or a new adaptation of an old cartoon, or of certainly a 1980s cartoon or something to that effect, there is this incredible antithetical reaction to it, which is informed by so much of this poisonous nostalgia. There was recently a Netflix series of She-Ra, the old 1980s cartoon. Now, you know, I was a child of the 1980s. I was born in 1984, so of course I watched He-Man and She-Ra. You as a young boy, you couldn't not, unless you didn't have a television in your house. It simply was impossible. It was everywhere. So I have as much association with it as any child of that era. But there is no objective comparison between the two works. The one that's produced now is infinitely better on every level. It's just a better work. It's a better product. But I have seen some of the most incredible reactions to that cartoon from people who are now about our age, who are sort of in their early to mid-30s, who, A, it's not aimed at, and B, perhaps should have moved on a little bit at this point. They maybe should have moved on a little bit at this point. But beyond that, I find the inability to see the reality of it. That the fact that the original She-Ra cartoon was produced on a shoestring budget, it's basically 50 pence and half a curly-whirly. It was designed as a toy catalogue. It only exists to sell you plastic. That's the only reason it exists. It does not want to tell you stories. It does not want to present you with an aesthetic sense. It does not want to provide mythology or anything like that. It wants to sell you things. The inability to perceive that, I find worrying. I find profoundly worrying, because I can't help but think that blindness, that rose-tinted blindness, expands to other things.
I mean, I think the whole notion of ownership when it comes to these franchises is very ambiguous in many ways, and fan fiction has complicated that even further.
The fact that it's being published as actual fiction very often these days, that doesn't help.
And people, I don't think people really know how to readapt mythologies, which is really what I think people are struggling and usually catastrophically failing to do with that. It's entirely possible for a writer in previous decades to just take a figure like Hercules from myth and readapt that into any story that they want. And there's this weird relationship with the notion of what's canonical, what the author owes, with canon being given a kind of ontological veracity that's bizarre, really.
It really is, and it often, when it's invoked, it reveals itself as being not only incredibly shrill and ugly in and of itself, it seems to lead to this almost fundamentalist perspective about things. It also exposes itself as massively infantile. Massively infantile. And I mean that on every level. I don't just mean in the sense that the people complaining about the new She-Ra are children and should shut up. I mean in the sense that there is a genuine withering of scope here, or rather there is a lack of scope. There's a scope that hasn't developed, it hasn't been fed. And it does seem to be informed by this notion of ownership, as though it's mine. My interpretation of this material is fundamental, and it cannot be denied.
It almost evokes the humanists' parodies of scholastic debate in terms of things like how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. This, when you're arguing like what counts as a Klingon.
Absolutely, it's absurd, isn't it? It does. I find myself wearied by it. I'll be honest. It sounds dismissive. It really does, and I suppose in a very real way, it is dismissive because, as I say, I am somewhat immersed in some of these mythologies. I enjoy them as much as anyone else. You find it very much in things like sort of the Transformers community, or in the Star Wars community. I imagine is just rife with it. Now, I'm not the biggest Star Wars fan, I've got to say.
I have huge I mean, it's a very, very basic story, even.
Absolutely, it's very basic. I understand why the original films were popular. I think they're very impressive on a technical level. The dirty little secret that no one really wants to acknowledge is that the scripts were terrible and the acting is bad and the story is humdrum.
Yes, the idea that these scripts got bad with the prequel episode.
With the prequels, yes, absolutely. I mean, that's absurd. That's absolutely absurd. The scripts were always bad. The scripts were always bad. They were never really about that. It's about the effects. It's about the visuals. It's about the grandeur of it, which is fair enough. But I found that the most recently produced Star Wars films I've had some interest in. Particularly The Last Jedi. I had some interest in it because I found the way it inverted, and I mean deliberately inverted, the formula of the previous films, very brave, given the fan base. And it, in many respects, the film is a meta-commentary on its own fan base. It is just shy of turning to the audience and breaking the fourth wall and saying to them, okay, we've seen everything that you want, that you assume about this mythology. We're going to move it on by breaking it. We're going to expose some of the innate hypocrisies of it, some of the moral complexities that were never commented upon before. It may as well have had a character sitting telling you that.
Yeah, and the really funny thing is that you can kind of see that the fans understand that they've been successfully critiqued, because instead of focusing on that subversion and trying to make some kind of argument against it, they focused entirely on the inanities of plot holes, on character continuity, and things that, of course, have never mattered in any kind of space opera context.
Absolutely. This is the exact point. It's the enshrinement of what's gone before, once again, as though the original 3 films are in any way perfect or immune to these problems, when in fact they exemplify them in many key respects. I can watch the original Star Wars films without the sound on quite happily, without any of the dialogue quite happily, because the dialogue is awful. It's just awful. It is almost universally bad.
And the plot beats are so archetypal, though, the plot beats, that you can almost tell the story of Star Wars in a series of pictures and convey it quite accurately. It has that quality.
Almost hieroglyphically. You could tell it almost hieroglyphically. But I find that particular inability to critique what one has association with really worrying. Really worrying, because once again, I understand the draw of nostalgia, and I understand how it can be a very beautiful thing, how it can be done well, how it can be used to evoke association. Well, of course, I have to understand. Anyone who operates in fiction to any degree has to understand this, because you use it. You use it all the time to manipulate your reader, to manipulate the audience. You use it to spark off emotional association, to lead them down particular avenues of assumption before breaking it or before subverting it. But at the same time, it seems that the particular species that's pervasive right now is very poisonous. It's highly poisonous. It's toxic, in fact, to use the word, the vogue term at the moment.
I think, it's so intimately bound with where these movies are in science fiction, in the increasingly tired superhero genres. And I had a friend actually recently talk to me about how comic books are doing really well in terms of their narratives right now. I don't really follow comics that much. And at the same time are commercially pretty much on their last legs. They have, whereas these movies are making absurd amounts of money, even obscene amounts of money, and yet narratively are deteriorating.
It's completely moribund.
And you can see that influence. It's the boards that take over these films. It's the commercial goals, and therefore lowest common denominator.
Absolutely, yes. We have to appeal to every demographic. We cannot alienate anyone. It cannot even be a film that does relatively well. It has to make all of the money. It has to make every cent and dollar, It's the same... interestingly, you have exactly the same thing happening in the video game market right now. It's more complex in the video game market, I would say, because there is such profound influence from the independent markets. It does seem at the moment that there is this wonderful sort of bedroom coder revolution, very, very similar to what happened in the 1980s in the UK with the advent of the microcomputers, the Sinclair and the BBC computers, and so on and so forth, where there are significant figures within video game creation who are just they're just making these little industries and franchises around themselves. You have them counterpointed to the monoliths the big traditional companies that devour smaller companies and chew them up and spit them out, who are themselves failing massively at this point, it seems, both artistically and in terms of, if recent reports are anything to go by, also financially.
Yeah, and it'd be interesting to actually work out why it's going differently and why they're not able. The major companies aren't able to capture this market. But the fascinating thing is just how deleterious markets are to the creation of any kind of art in this sense, and how the second money becomes the primary aim of artistic production, it deteriorates inevitably, and always in this exact way, in terms of an artificial nostalgia that can't really capture the thing that it's channeling.
Well, it does seem as though the people who then are responsible for making the creative decisions around the product never understand what was significant about it in the first place. They're often outside of the sphere of interest. It's exactly, interestingly, what happened to Games Workshop prior to its recent revolution. I mean, that company was on its last legs.
They had a series of CEOs who hadn't played the game, I understand.
Yeah, who had no interest. They were literally brought on from banks and from vast Fortune 500 companies, under the understanding that they would be able to make money from it. But it's a hobby company. Its entire product is based upon maintaining enthusiasm and connection with its audience. And as a result of that, of course, they tried to force the players and the audience into buying and playing and engaging with the hobby in a particular way, in ways that they didn't want to. And of course, that's death. It's death for your established audience, and you will not get any new audience on the back of it.
I think the exact same thing happened to Waterstones a while back, and the relationship between, because I have some history in small publishing, and the relationship between small publishers and Waterstones has always been pretty bad.
Fraught. Yes, it's been fraught, hasn't it?
But they did deteriorate. I'm not sure where they are now. I imagine it's not that much better. But they did deteriorate, and they had somebody whose background, I think, was in supermarkets, and literally took a sort of like how to sell canned beans approach to books. That did not revive. I mean, the Waterstones always play this, and they have played this thing for quite a while, where they pretend to be the poor, unfortunate underguy to Amazon, which, without saying anything good about Amazon, is patently ridiculous.
Yeah.
But yeah, and you see that approach, that sort of taking the idea that you experience in one area of the market allows you to sell anything in exactly.
It's so bizarre, isn't it? It's so strange, and that seems to be a problem that we have in a lot of our structures and our institutions at the moment. You have people making decisions for things like, for example, the NHS, who have never operated in it at all. Like, they have no clue how it actually functions, about the day-to-day grist of the thing. Education and almost every aspect of our culture operates on that absurdity, that core absurdity. And it seems to be one of those it's one of those things that we accept because it's traditional. That's simply something that has always been, and something that will always be. But the notion, and also the primary imperative, the notion that the only reason any of these things exist is because they have to make money. I know it's a very tried and true. It's a cliche of a certain demographic, a certain political demographic, to bring this up and to keep harping on about it. But the notion that the language of the market is infesting every aspect of our cultures, and at this point has infested every. Let's not beat about the bush. It has infested every aspect of our cultures. Education is a very good example. I mean, universities market themselves.
I remember briefly working in a university, and very occasionally hearing students being referred to as clients, and it always struck me as just. I mean, in my view, it's a bit of a controversial idea, perhaps, but the whole idea that universities are primarily teaching institutions is, in my view, backwards. Universities are primarily research institutions that also teach. And and the loss of that, the reframing of them as teaching institutions, and then the denigrating them to the status of schools as continuations of schools,
Yep.
and then the denigration of schools so that they are entirely framed around how can we deliver students who will increase GDP, who will, and so all the way through the whole education system. There is this increasingly poisonous attitude of treating students like economic units and treating the institutions like that they are secondary to the market, that they are market organizations. And really, in a sense, it's kind of amazing that the university even exists, and even in the diminished form that it does now, as a medieval institution that has sort of endured right through modernity.
Yeah.
It's always had an odd relationship to capitalism, and I think a fraught one, and it's really coming to a head now. And I do wonder whether or not it can continue to exist in its current form without serious changes to the way that we think about political economy.
Well, that does seem to be an issue that's facing quite a few of our institutions at the moment. It seems to be pervasive. It's a pervasive disease. I have a friend, Tom, who is an Anglican vicar, and he's on the very edge of signing his resignation at the moment, simply because he profoundly disagrees with the way it is currently being run, which is in a I hesitate to use the term, but in a very capitalist way.
Grew up in the Anglican Church. My mother was one of the first women ordained, and I think came to very much the same conclusions. She wrote a collection of prose poems called Stale Bread and Miracles, which covers a lot of this subject. And I think it's profoundly true that, I mean, even in ways, as somebody who's no longer really identifies with Anglicanism in terms of its faith, I still sort of have some sense of its history. And
of course,
there was a statement, I can't remember which archbishop said it, but something about how the church needs to open its doors to paganism in order to stay relevant. And just thinking, historically, this is bizarre. This is the weirdest thing that's... You know, if you could go back to the Anglican Church of old and say this is your future, there would be people sort of gouging their eyes out.
Yeah, it's the oddest thing, and it's even more an absurd statement when you look back at the history of the church and of churches themselves. I mean, you don't need to throw open the doors to paganism; it's already there. It's already part and parcel of the bedrock of the assumptions of the institution, but it's so strange, isn't it? And why? To stay relevant. Just to stay relevant.
Not an authentic theological shift, but I think that would be to assume that the bulk of that institution really even has a theology anymore, which I think might be even too generous to a lot of...
Well, I have discussed this at length with Tom, and he's very candid about it. He's very candid. He says there is this swell at the moment of people within the Anglican faith, particularly the vicars, the fathers, the people who actually ministrate, whereby there is just going to be a mass exodus very soon. Very, very soon. He's, again, very candid. He says, my flock, they are very often very old, by and large. We have very, very few people actually attending. And there are no new people coming in. And there is also, I mean, the thing that really shocked me, because I as someone who has operated outside of most churches most of his life, apart from incidentally, who just enjoys them for their architecture and their poetry and their history and whatnot, I didn't realize that there is this incredible, very far-right influence in the Anglican Church at the moment, in the upper echelons of the Anglican Church. What Tom was telling me is that they are looking to the models provided by US evangelical churches because they make money.
And they also attract more converts and in terms of competition, you know, if I actually had a desire to go back to that, and I was looking at the local churches, the Anglican Church wouldn't even rank amongst the ones that I would even consider. It doesn't have a community, it doesn't have a coherent theology or metaphysics. It's. I'm not trying to insult Anglicans. I think that a lot of them are genuine, and some of the nicest people, the best people I ever knew were
absolutely. This is a commentary on the institution.
The institution as a whole has become very hollowed out. You can even see it in the way that, for example, there's been this almost seamless move from them being the Tories at prayer to increasingly in the sort of middle ranks to becoming very Labourite and very sort of pro-Labour, which is a whole other interesting institution.
Yeah, in and of itself. So you have one problematic institution affiliating itself with another very
and it's seeming so hypocritical that it seems just it's not moving with the times in any authentic sense. It's just where do we see the future and how do we survive? And this is what the worst institutions always become.
Oh, absolutely, and it's a lack of conviction, ironically, isn't it? An institution that is founded upon the very notion of conviction, that markets itself as being such anyway, as a marker of abstraction in our society, as metaphysical, demonstrating none of it.
It's very close to Kierkegaard's critique of Christianity as he saw it becoming, and this isn't a tradition I see myself as a part of anymore, but that Christendom is antithetical to Christianity, that to have these establishments reinforcing faith doesn't acknowledge what faith fundamentally is.
Totally. I suppose you see the ultimate expression of that across the pond, don't you, with the evangelical support of Trump?
Well, I mean, things like wealth ministries. I mean, whatever you think about Christian belief, the idea of merging that with this notion of salvation in money is bizarre.
It is so strange, isn't it? I mean, as someone who has never been part of these traditions, I do enjoy the stories. I enjoy reading the Bible. I think you have to if you want to understand the traditions of Western literature, for one thing. And there is not much that Christ is unambiguous about in the Gospels that's consistent. But one thing that damn well is, and is very clear, is the hatred of money and materialism. It's absolutely unambiguous. It's totally clear. There is no wiggle room here.
No, absolutely none. There's considerably less than certain other so-called moral issues that evangelicals have liked to take up and turn into sort of beating sticks. It's absolute that to be rich is to put your soul in jeopardy. Absolutely,
yes. It is antithetical to Christianity, and certainly to what Christianity originally was, which was this revolutionary anti-materialism movement. I just find it bizarre. I mean, what it does. I don't like to project psychoanalysis upon people that I've never met, but it does demonstrate to me that there is an arguing in bad faith element to it. They don't actually believe what they proclaim to believe. Rather, they use the language as a means of maintaining particular statuses of privilege and underprivilege, and as a means of scapegoating. I mean, one thing I will say now, I don't do it much anymore. I don't argue with people about moral issues relating to faith or a lack of faith. It's a waste of time. But one thing I will say, to say an evangelical supporting Trump supporter, if they dare talk to me about, say, sexual morality, with regards to my own sexuality, I will not talk to them. I will not acknowledge the conversation. They don't get a place at the adult table, I'm afraid.
I mean, in a sense, it's impossible to have a conversation with somebody who wants to deny your right to exist.
I've tried, and it's something that it's another rather poisonous thing that I find leaching into culture of late, which is, and it tends to come largely from the sort of left of centre, which is this: can't we all sit down and get along? Can't we all sit down? Can you not be so shrill? Can you not be so extreme? And so on and so forth. And ironically, what we're talking about is refusing to be screamed at that certain demographics want as extinct. That's what we're talking about here. We're denying extinction. It is not the case that we're refusing to listen. It is not that we're being unreasonable. There is no reasonable conversation to be had with someone who ultimately wants you dead. And they're very good at it, don't get me wrong. Those who do want us dead, and they unambiguously do, are very good at disguising it. At the moment, they're very good at disguising it. They will use every slimy little trick, every euphemism, every obfuscation available to them to muddy the waters. But ultimately, what they're promoting is a genocidal perspective, no matter how softly spoken.
Yes, yeah. And more dangerous for how softly spoken it is. And I think in terms of that centrism as well, there's a similar sneaking ideas through. So you see that whilst they maintain generally let's talk to everyone stance, they become more angry with the people defending themselves against this than they are against the people doing the more genocidal type rhetoric.
Well, it's the whole blame the victim mentality, isn't it? Which is psychologically established as something that human beings just do. It's something we do because it's easier for us. It's just easier for us to blame the victim than to blame the victimizer, both on a domestic level and a personal level and on a wider political or sociocultural level. And very often what the people who are arguing from a sort of left-of-centre perspective, who are basically asking us to sit down and talk with the people who want us exterminated, they don't seem to understand that I hate being this guy, I really do I hate using this language, but they are often arguing from positions of safety.
Yes, and I think really also as well positions of safety that are becoming increasingly precarious, and that's why they're willing to cast out to extreme views to the right, because they see a potential there to preserve their positions more than they see that further to their left. I mean, to use very, very reductionistic language. And you see that, I mean, you were talking earlier about, in terms of our discussion of nostalgia, about the press and how these tropes have become common in the press and these ways of talking have become common in the press. And I see that very much because they've become, in a way, the incidental arbiters of power in modernity after, you've seen the disempowerment really of politics, so that politics becomes an increasingly narrower and narrower domain. You've seen the loss of power of religious institutions. And I really think that the press has accidentally filled those vacuums without really any kind of mechanism or understanding about how to govern, or even an awareness that they are governing. And
I think that's absolutely true. And it's evident, of course, in our own country. It's evident given recent, ongoing situations right now.
And without that awareness, and when that starts slipping, I think what they just fundamentally can't even comprehend what's happening anymore, and so that's why they fall back on these nostalgia tropes. Because I think as much as they're trying to satiate the panic of their readership, their more loyal readership, they're actually trying to deal with their own panic and their own sense of uncertainty. Often, it's very much it's almost like a repeated set of manchas, these nostalgia terms.
There is almost a prayer bead quality to it, isn't there? There is a catechism element to it. Yeah, it is a almost like a culture-wide security blanket. It's massive, and in that regard is infantile, is powerfully infantile and skirt-clinging, and must be rejected. It must be rejected. It must be grown up from.
I mean, one of the advantages of reading a lot of utopias going all the way back is that over and over again you really get this sense from utopian writers of a certain type, especially the more reactionary ones, that they're clinging on to something, that demonstrations of strength in these imaginative fantasies are themselves the result of a loss of strength or a loss of real influence.
So they're almost expressions of subconscious weakness or sublimated weakness.
Yes, yeah. I think Thomas More, because he has a way of encapsulating everything in the genre at one time, and even I think in many ways anticipates the dystopia and the anti-utopia. That he has a way of being sort of both that and the other kind of utopia. There's a sense of clinging on to a conception of medievalism, but then as a humanist, he's also trying to work out a way past an impasse, and it's a genre really defined by that uncomfortable tension.
And it is a very uncomfortable tension, isn't it? It's almost a form of storytelling that tears itself apart at the seams at conception.
Yeah. And that's why I think it keeps getting reinvented. And also, it's a genre, perhaps more than any other, that's always in communication with itself, and that usually signifies some kind of tension at the heart of it. Almost every utopia is a response to another utopia, and as you go into modernity, you also find this very strange phenomenon, and you find this especially with I'm trying to think the name. Here, let me just. It's easier to when my mind's not. H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells, a phenomenon of writing over and over and over again the same utopia with minor tweaks to it. So it's sort of like it's got all these same features. Every one of them has a lot of population control, a sort of global, very autocratic socialist state. But he'll tweak this and he'll tweak that, and it's like he can't quite get it right in his mind. There's something always missing. There's something not really working.
By the way, ladies and gentlemen, just speaking to the audience briefly, if you've ever read Wells, go and do so, but be prepared. He's very difficult to read. He's very difficult to read. I mean, I enjoy reading rather large works, but even his shorter works, like, say, The Time Machine, is phenomenally hard to get through.
It's very turgid. It's very involved with itself. Let's say. My favorite of his utopias is probably the one that's most explicit about the tensions in his thinking, and it's called A Modern Utopian. It's probably one of his least read books.
I was going to say I don't think I've ever come across it.
Quite fascinating, actually. Not in the level of a utopia in terms of the institutions he designs. It's all fairly typical of him, and it's also fairly typical of his time. There's a ghastly amount of sort of population control, Malthusian nonsense. But he actually has two characters appear on a stage at the beginning of the utopia, and they're from slightly different classes, although they're both rich. I think one of them's more of a sort of bumbling aristocratic bohemian, another one's a botanist or something, a professional. And one of them's, as you say, bohemian. The other one is slightly puritanical, stiff upper lip kind of character. And they both, between them, imagine this utopia on the stage, and it springs around them as they're imagining it. And then they'll have arguments, and after their arguments, things will change in the utopia. And so it's almost like these two sides of Wells' thinking are arguing it out and trying to actually perfect the utopia in real time, and never really able to. There's almost a desperation in the novel, and it comes closest to something that's sort of more authentic from him as a writer.
It's wonderful. It's almost the device is it's a meta commentary upon itself, upon the very nature of utopianism. Very, very clever.
And the irony of calling it a modern utopia, because it's sort of. I think he meant it to be, the perfect encapsulation of what a modern utopia is, but it's sort of the word modern sort of hints more at sort of modern literary devices.
That's right. Yeah, it's almost. It sounds to me like it's more postmodern than anything.
It has that feeling. I mean, it almost feels like if you were to write a utopia with Deadpool as the central character, it would probably be something like that, but slightly funnier.
I would buy that comic, I think. That sounds phenomenally good. Based on that framework, that, I think, would be hilarious. And potentially quite good as a piece of utopian fiction.
Absolutely. I mean, I think having, especially having that sort of interface with popular culture, utopias for me work best when they go to one of the root myths of the genre, which is the cocaine myths, and these lands of infinite abundance, and they're always very hedonistic myths about, you'll have things like birds will throw themselves into the fire so that they just cook themselves for you, and you'll have rivers of wine and golden streets and so on and so forth.
It's a kind of indolence, isn't it? It's like an enshrinement of human indolence.
But they usually have a very peasant origin, and later incarnations like the Big Rock Candy Mountain is very much a sort of working class American folk story, which is exactly the same thing. It's very much cocaine reinvented.
It's almost an Edenic myth, isn't it? It's like a return to Eden.
Yeah, and I think almost a sort of Eden without any kind of Puritanism, and that sense of what are we lacking? We're lacking leisure, time, the basic necessities, and these are the things that are grasped onto. And utopias are almost more interesting when they have these qualities, when they're interested in the sensuous, the texture of life.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it's something that I find massively appealing, not just exclusively in utopian fiction, although I think utopian fiction exemplifies it to a certain degree. It's as you say, this sort of slice of life sensuality, where you have descriptions of experience that are intense and are very tangible. They're sort of viscerally described. It's something I find very, very appealing. And in that regard, very often plot or narrative are not necessary, or can actually be deleterious.
It's a very mythic genre, so it doesn't necessarily require... It's usually a framing device. Yeah. I think that's the way it's done. I mean, it can be interesting to try and narrativize utopias, and you can create some really interesting examples from that. Aldous Huxley's Island, which is a tragic utopia, I would say. It's a sort of a utopia that's doomed by its very goodness, which is.
It's a massively despairing look at not just utopianism but humanity, isn't it? Just the very notion of society, that even if we can perfect what we're trying to create here, the grand experiment of culture and society, it still may not work or sustain itself. It's a very interesting look. I mean, a lot of people would say that's the point at which utopianism and dystopianism sort of blend into one another, and it becomes very difficult to discern one from the other.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's impossible, really, for utopianism to exist now independent of the dystopia genre without being, to a certain degree, just in pure nostalgic exercise. And they do exist. They're very rare.
They are very rare these days, aren't they? I mean, it's the very postmodern notion of hauntology, isn't it? That we cannot imagine better anymore. We cannot imagine tomorrow anymore, which of course relates back to what we were talking about earlier with the societal, the cultural turn to nostalgia. But yes, I mean, it's something I see in the Fallout games, for example. I find it very difficult to distinguish in the Fallout games what is dystopian and what is utopian, because the setting is dystopian, but some of the smaller situations, the smaller civilizations and societies that you find are distinctly utopian.
The idea of finding a dystopia, a utopia in a post-apocalypse is a really interesting one with a strange and largely forgotten legacy. And actually, one of the original practitioners of it was Mary Shelley in The Last Man, and she has very interesting descriptions of the various characters of that book, who are all fictionalized versions of different men in her life, and how they take over as the apocalypse is happening and govern completely wisely and brilliantly, and with absolute perfection of virtue and might. I mean, and knowing these people, of course, biographically, you know that this is a vast distortion of
it becomes apparent that these people are not how they're being represented. There's almost like a slightly Ayn Rand quality to that, isn't there? There is a slight where these characters are represented as the epitomes of all that is virtuous and good in humanity, to the point whereby they almost become parodic.
Jack London is a really good example of someone from the left who does that that exact Ayn Rand thing, even down to having all of his socialist heroes being ridiculously muscular.
Oh no, really? Oh, that's brilliant. I want to read that now.
The Iron Heel. It's a decent dystopia that sort of morphs into an eventual utopia. Like it's
Right.
yeah, but it's and then there's even stranger ones. Some of the strangest utopias are post-apocalyptic. There's one from 1887 called The Crystal Age by a guy called W.H. Hudson, and it's mostly about gender and new familial organizations and such, but it's got this really dark twist at the end, which I won't ruin because it's...
No, that sounds up my alley, I would say.
And yeah, I mean, there are some... Those ones tend to be the weirdest because of the framing of the apocalypse, I guess, because it's such a condemnation on everything that came before. So there's none of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's none of that Moore or Morris stuff about like, oh, we've got to blend the new society with the old society.
It's a sweeping clean, isn't it? It's a basic assumption that things are so saturated that we have to start from the ground up. Our entire assumptions of culture and society need to be done away with. And I must admit, it's something I do have a great deal of sympathy with. It's an idea I have a great deal of sympathy with. It's almost a kind of nihilism. It's an expression of how something good can come from nihilism. Or something at least productive can come from nihilism. Interesting. Utopian nihilism.
And I was just thinking that's a good phrase.
That's a great phrase. I'm going to call the video that.
I mean, there's a lot of nihilistic hints throughout. I mean, overall, obviously, a genre that tries to constantly gain and retain optimism, but there's a lot of nihilistic hints throughout the utopian genre. I love some of the dates that are put on them. There's a utopia that I've been looking for a long while. Let me just see if I can. Got a list that I keep, which helps me remember them all because there are ridiculous.
So many.
Here is Walter Brown. I've never been able to find it. It's one of the earlier all-women utopias, allegedly. I can't be sure because I haven't read it.
Right.
And it's called 2894, and it was written in 1894. So just the date that he puts on his utopia is fantastically pessimistic. It's going to take that long. So yeah, and it's. Well,
I suppose there is a pessimism inherent, isn't there, in utopianism? There is an evocation of pessimism in the sense that if you have to evoke a utopian society in your fiction, then you are not living in it.
I think the best optimistic utopias then tend to be the ones that are careful in their projections, and William Morris's News from Nowhere is probably the best example because it comes after a quite bloody revolution, and it is quite a nice utopia. The complaints you can make about 19th century ideas of gender that are exemplified for it, but contextually, it's one of the utopias you'd probably least not want to live in.
Least not want to live in. That's great, and it's fantastic describing a utopia like that. Because, of course, the popular assumption is that, falsely, as it turns out, that utopia is the society that everyone would want to live in.
Morris had a fantastic phrase that he used, because his utopia was a direct rebuttal to another, Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, and he hated everything about this. And he said the only safe way of reading a utopia is as an expression of the preferences of the author, which I quite like.
Fantastic. It's pithy and it's rather cutting, isn't it? It's a little bit trenchant.
Yes, yeah. But on the other hand, I mean, the influence of the genre outside of itself is phenomenal.
Oh, it's huge, and it's bizarre, isn't it? Because I imagine utopianism is one of those niche genres that most people either don't realize that they've read utopian fiction, or don't even know exists.
Yes, I think that it's becoming more and more. So I actually saw a comment on Medium a while back where someone was amazed about the discovery of Thomas More, like, oh, that Utopia is an actual book. There's a I mean, but you can see its influence at different times. I mean, I mentioned Bellamy. There's also him and James Harrington, probably the two most influential. Harrington wrote a book called in 1656, allegedly on the night of the King's execution after the English Civil War. I don't know if that's actually true. It sounds like one of those kind of...
It sounds rather romanticized, doesn't it? A little too narrative, perhaps.
But he outlined ideas in that, such as divided powers, a two-chamber system of government, rotative government, electoral districts, etc., that were very much still being talked about in the framing of the American governmental system, and definitely had an influence on that. And so sometimes when people sort of attack the idea of utopianism as a worthwhile endeavor and say, oh, you can never really realize a utopia, I say, well, if you don't write your utopia, you'll probably end up living in
someone else's, of course. It's the old cliche, but it's absolutely true. It's absolutely true. And for one thing, you can't really express to yourself what you want, can you? You will always be subject to what's happening around you, to whatever context you were born into.
And I think Wells, in his own haphazard way, sort of understood that in a modern utopia, that sense of grasping and never really being able to attain it. And Morris, because he situates his utopia, he calls it a utopia of rest. It's in a period of transition, and the idea is that you can't really predict the kind of society that would come out of these new conditions after this revolution, which is a very Marxist conception.
It's a very Marxist conception, and also, but at the same time, it's a very, very present day one, isn't it? It's something that has resonance now in much of the fiction that's being written. And I would say, for my money, that approach to utopianism in fiction is probably the most legitimate, where you can't determine what's going to happen. There is a degree of chaos and anarchy, I suppose, in that. It's acknowledging the uncertainty, acknowledging chaos.
Absolutely, yeah. It's there in most of the later utopias, and I think the more utopia has evolved as a genre, the more it's embraced that idea. It wasn't very strong in the 19th century, when there was a huge explosion of attempts to create exact blueprints, and I think that's the genre that's really died now. And my hope is that the genre will re-emerge as something much more grounded in that kind of ineffability, a sort of almost an inversion of Lovecraftian ineffability, ineffable pessimism replaced by ineffable optimism. You can't predict how bad things might be beyond the remit of human epistemic knowledge, and actually you can't predict how good it might be either.
Yeah, absolutely. By definition. But this is actually something. It's interesting you bring up Lovecraft. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love his pessimism. I absolutely love the cosmic nihilism of Lovecraft, but I love it on an aesthetic level almost, rather than a philosophical one. I like the feeling of it in my head beyond anything else. But by its very nature, the fact that he is evoking the unknowns of things that are beyond human experience, yes, by definition, it's also true that there may be incredible potential in those unknowns. By definition, that's the case. If we cannot know, and that's always the problem I've had as a writer with Lovecraft, because there is an element of Lovecraft in my fiction, definitely, but I tend to go for the more hopeful, as you pointed out, the utopianism element, which I didn't even know was there until you pointed it out.
I mean, I think what I find most utopian in your work is that core of the refuge for the outsiders, which I think is a line that's quite strong in... today isn't a good one for names for me, apparently.
I'm going to call that the title of the episode. Today is a good one for names. I rather like that too. In fact, that could be a collection or something.
It would be a good anthology name.
It would, wouldn't it? Actually, it may turn up. I may steal it.
To reference a different writer, since my head isn't currently working, Octavia Butler does that very well. I think that sense of ineffable optimism, to use this phrase. She has that same concept of alienness that you find in Lovecraft, where the aliens aren't just like Tolkien mythic races, just abstract versions of our own virtues or vices. Dwarves represent certain human proclivities, elves represent, and then you get space elves and space dwarves, essentially. But the aliens are actually fundamentally unhuman in the most profound sense, in the sense that they can barely even be comprehended. Except she doesn't then do the Lovecraftian thing of saying, well, therefore they are necessarily sinister. That in their absolute alienness, they must be malign at the same time.
I think that's something that just derives from Lovecraft's own neuroses about everything, quite frankly. I mean, in that, I believe he was expressing his own fundamental fear of humanity and of everything around him, which was probably just as a result of his influences, his upbringing, his past. I mean, my goodness. If you want a portrait of a ruined man.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. And I think it's why it's a mistake to try and tease out what's good and bad about Lovecraft, because you end up missing the whole of his metaphysics.
It happens a lot. I mean, it's a sad thing, really. It is a sad thing, and I don't think it's illegitimate at all. It's worth discussing, these matters. Absolutely, they're worth discussing. But I think it's then a mistake to go on and to disregard the body of work, the metaphysics, the wider implications, because the metaphysics is fantastic in its scope. It's just the vastness of it. This little man, this little ruined man in his isolated little room, scribbling away obsessively, imagining an expanse that doesn't just incorporate the universe, it incorporates not even a multiverse, it incorporates all of reality, all of what we might call reality. It is incredible.
And genuinely not predicated on anything else. So, I mean, if you think about Tolkien and the Silmarillion, there is an expansive metaphysics there, but there's also this synthesis of particular paganisms.
Absolutely. Tolkien's Catholicism, absolutely.
Whereas with Lovecraft, there's a sort of originality. It's not a phrase I often like, but I think it's very applicable to Lovecraft, and it serves to illustrate him very well. And you can see that in the failed attempts to copy,
of which there are many. I mean, he is a subgenre in and of himself. He is a subgenre. It's any breed of horror, fantasy, or science fiction where there is forbidden knowledge, where there are things that man is not meant to wot of, where you can actually be fundamentally transformed by exposure to ideas, and of course where people will start spontaneously sprouting tentacles at any given point.
Yeah, that's the worst sign of a copy, sort of taking the most superficial aspects of the other story and just replicating it. Yeah.
I mean, don't get me wrong, it can be done well. It has been done well. There are certain... some of Ramsey Campbell's stories do it rather well, largely because they only allude to Lovecraft and his mythology, or they take the ethos of the mythology and then add their own inventions to it. So he doesn't necessarily reference Nyarlathotep or Cthulhu specifically. There will be an entity that is of his own creation, and therefore has its own state and aspects and agendas, which I think works rather well. Lovecraft's mythology is so widely open that you can do that.
Yeah, and it resists, to go back to earlier in the discussion, that problem of the canon in fan fiction, because there's no way you can canonize Lovecraft. It's I mean, for starters, I'm not that conversant with it, but I understand that there are things that directly contradict each other.
Absolutely. And he never did it himself, of course. He never actually sat down and wrote the Bible of Lovecraft. everything in his mythology has been inferred by other writers largely, and by people who have read his work. And in fact, at this point, I would probably argue that a lot of the stuff that people regard as iconic of Lovecraft is probably from other writers, barring very core elements, or the more superficial iconic elements like Cthulhu or Dagon or whatever. But yeah, he's in that regard, he's the opposite of Tolkien, where everything is very rigid and very definite, and was written down very much like a Bible if you read the Silmarillion.
And you can see the academic side of Tolkien in that he sees it in the same way he sees studying mythology, studying the Icelandic sagas, for example. Yes. It's about documenting something and creating something that's maybe entertaining, but ultimately it's a very academic exercise.
It is. It's a vehicle, isn't it? I mean, I'm sure I remember reading somewhere that he actually designed the Lord of the Rings as simply that, just as a vehicle for these various races, images, primarily the languages that he'd created. He was a linguist first and foremost. And you can certainly see that in the text. It's very different from The Hobbit in that regard. The Hobbit is much more of a story. It's in terms of the way it's written, the style of the prose, it's far more Indiana Jones adventure story in that regard. Whereas The Lord of the Rings is rather difficult to read, I imagine, for a lot of present-day readers, because it is rather leaden.
Yes, yeah. It reads like almost a series of stylistic exercises. And then if you've read things like Beowulf, if you've read things like the Icelandic sagas, you'll kind of see those crop up. If you've read, of course, the Bible.
Of course, you'll see it crop up. Not quite as overtly as you would in Lewis, but it's definitely an influence.
They argued over exactly that.
Well, having read Tolkien's letters to Lewis about the Chronicles of Narnia, Tolkien was quite vicious about the Chronicles of Narnia. I think he described it as ridiculous. I think he described it as absurd. And I imagine it's simply that in the creation of the Lord of the Rings, the Silmarillion, the wider mythology of Middle-earth, Tolkien did not have a wider agenda, or an ideological agenda, really. It was an academic exercise, whereas C.S. Lewis most definitely did.
Yeah, I mean, with Lewis, there's almost a tragic level of never really feeling like he was authentically anything. And I think he's constantly trying to prove things at that level, and it's most tragic in, I can't remember the name of the work, but the book he wrote on mourning, which a lot of people like. I find it very maudlin and almost like grotesque in certain ways.
It's an interesting thing, isn't it? I mean, Lewis is very akin to Lovecraft for me in the sense that it's very easy to demonize the man. Very easy. And don't get me wrong, he is a man who would have me dead. He absolutely, for various different reasons. But at the same time, the more I learn about him, and the more I learn about the things that he experienced, the more I feel a degree of sympathy for him. I do feel, again, that there is a ruined human being at the core of this. There is a very broken, sad human being. That doesn't diminish some of the the nastier elements of his texts, but it makes them understandable. It makes them understandable in the same way as it does for Lovecraft.
Yeah, and I mean that aspect of seeing the personal in text, it's fascinating to do that, going back to Utopia with different utopian writers. I was recently reading a book about different 19th century utopian writers, and it's quite easy to dislike Edward Bellamy, who I've mentioned before, for various reasons. His conception of socialism is very autocratic. He essentially just imagines, it's almost as if, what if we had the most banal aspects of capitalism, consumerism, the lack of any authentic culture, the inauthentic social relations, but just without the inequalities and so on.
Right. Which is phenomenally banal, isn't it? And somewhat misses the point, I imagine. For me, anyway. It's a utilitarian utopianism, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, you kind of but when you relate that to his own life, he was incredibly socially anxious, and that comes across in his utopia all the time. It's a utopia of extreme privacy, where everyone gets to live their own idealized bohemian 19th century gentleman life in the confines of their own very tightly bounded home.
It's fascinating. I mean, it does sound as though for you. I mean, it's true of all fiction, but certainly for utopian fiction, it seems that knowing something of the writer helps with analysis of the text massively.
Because context for utopia, because it's a genre, as I say, in conversation with itself, it's almost impossible, I think, to either read free of biographical detail, because it's almost the missing half of almost every utopia, as Morris quite cleverly observed, and the broader genre as a whole, because reading, for example, News from Nowhere without at least some working knowledge of Edward Bellamy and what Morris is writing against, it's again not the whole picture. It's a very skewed vision.
You get a very myopic view of what's going on, almost like it becomes almost a comic book of itself without that context. And I imagine because utopianism is so bound up with ideas, because it is projecting so much, you need to know these contexts. You need to know, like, when it was produced, for one thing, what society it was produced in, and therefore what pressures were acting upon it, what concerns were pervasive. Yeah, it's very interesting. It's where Foucault does not apply, almost.
Well, Foucault's, I mean, he's the sort of almost absurdly exaggerated version of the death of the author, isn't it, Foucault? And I think, I mean, I have a lot of problems with that whole. I mean, I have a lot of problems with Foucault per se. I think that it's a very limiting philosophy, but and not quite as left wing as he tends to be depicted as.
No, well, in the Jordan Peterson world, yes.
But in the Jordan Peterson world, Attila the Hun starts to look left wing.
That's absolutely, yes.
But yeah, I mean, I think in a way, the death of the utopia is less about less utopias being written. If you look for them, there are plenty, and it's more to do with the loss of that contextual factor. People write them more as stylistic exercises, in which case biographical details become less important, and then they write them not. If they have a reference point, it's always a particular utopia that they're dredging from distant past. I can't find a single example of a utopia written, probably in the last 40 years that references another utopia written at the same time. Within a decade period.
So it's almost a genre that's almost eating itself.
I think so. I mean, I think it's been through other periods of even 100-year periods since more of going into decline and then coming back. So I'm relatively optimistic about its long-term survival prospects.
I wonder if there are particular social pressures or circumstances that cause utopianism. I mean, I know from my intimacy with it, it's certainly true of horror. It's and I imagine true of most genres. I mean, it's this notion of context not being important, or which people misinterpret Foucault's Death of the Author to mean exclusively, which it doesn't. It has problems in and of itself in a more legitimate interpretation, but that particular simplification of it is totally wrong. But it does seem that genres of fiction generally occur or become more prominent in response to very particular cultural circumstances. A very good example would be the efflorescence of cinematic horror after the Vietnam civil rights movement era in the US.
Yeah, and within horror as well, the rise of the haunted house narrative after the Gilded Age and the dilapidated old ghastly buildings that sort of proliferated across the American landscape.
Yes,
and I think that, and of course what that symbolized in terms of that era of decadence that fed into an era of decline. In the utopia genre, the 1970s are very illustrative because it's the sort of last revival period.
Of course, the high watermark, as Hunter S. Thompson describes it.
Yes, that's a really brilliant phrase, actually. I think it's very apt that it's...
it resonates with... I adore that that particular section. I love it. I absolutely love it. It's beautiful. The notion of the old and the evil, which is inevitable, which wins in the end, which returns as the optimism recedes from its high watermark.
It's a great. I mean, you can watch that scene distinct in terms of the film version of it, which is got some brilliant scenes and some terrible scenes. But you can watch that scene sort of almost as a work of itself.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a highlight. I mean, it's interesting to look at what utopias were written in the 1970s as well, because, of course, the utopias before there's a sort of acceleration of liberal utopias demanding a certain set of things, and really you can almost see those utopias as dying out because they succeeded. You can't write a utopia like Harrington not because his dreams are absurd or far-fetched, but because we have all of them. We've got everything, and not many people regard it as utopian.
No, it is the case of having what you wanted and finding that it's not what you need.
And the utopianism of the 70s seems to be what's left behind by the sort of failed radicalisms of liberal revolution. So it's ecology, it's feminism, it's
sexual liberation, that sort of thing.
And that sort of peters out in the 80s. I think people often reference Thatcher and Reagan and there is no alternative and concepts like that. And it should be interesting with whether or not that view, which I think was perfectly encapsulated. Slavoj Žižek often points this out, and I definitely have my issues with a lot of what Žižek says, but
absolutely, but he's very amusing. If nothing else,
Fukuyama encapsulates that period very well in terms of the death of history, because although there was a sense that obviously history couldn't die, that there was assumption in the 90s for especially people who were more comfortable that nothing would ever change.
Nothing would ever
except
change.
maybe mildly improve over time. And that's kind of gone. So it would be interesting to see if utopia comes back in that context, in the context of the financial clash and so on. And there are, I mean, Robert Llewellyn, the guy who plays Crichton in.
Certainly do.
Yeah, he wrote one called News from Gardania, of all things, which is a charming utopia in its way. There's 2 sequels which I haven't read yet, and obvious reference to Morris. And my favourite of the more contemporary ones, Nisi Scholl, an American author, wrote a book called Everfair that it's the only example of a historical what-if utopia that I've encountered, and it imagines the Belgian Congo freeing itself and becoming a utopia with the aid of the Fabian Society. It's a fantastically weird premise, and it
is fantastically weird.
and it's I mean, as the only historical what if utopia, because I think it comes a lot out of Afrofuturist work, and there's a lot of what if.
And that seems to be rather pervasive at the moment, doesn't it? There seems to be a swell of the Afrofuturist stuff in pop. It seems to be becoming much more mainstream.
Yes, and I think that means that there's a kind of not even a re-examining, but actually a discovery of the material that's behind it, which is quite good because there's a lot of material that's relatively unexamined. I mean, even the term Afrofuturist is quite reductive.
It's quite absolutely, and also quite new, isn't it? I mean, it's something that seems to have only gained popular traction within the last decade, if that.
Yes, I would say that's accurate, especially for the mainstream. And I think there is a sort of vein of utopianism there that's quite strong. I mean, it's there in Octavia, but I don't think I actually like the term Afrofuturism, but insofar as she relates to a lot of those authors, you can definitely see that utopianism in the way she depicts aliens and other kind of unhuman encounters. And also how she reflects on what
says even sometimes satirically about human civilization. And the other line of utopianism, I think you mentioned it earlier in the conversation, is that sort of incidental utopia where certain books will just be utopias
without realizing it. I see that very often in there was a groundswell of it in the sort of popular fiction of the 1980s that seemed to cross genres. It's what would be called speculative fiction. It would be marketed under speculative fiction. There was this groundswell of sort of dark fantasy, science fiction, and horror that was all melded together. And there are a lot of writers operating in that particular cauldron who seem to have this incredible vein of utopianism, but they would not call it utopianism. I don't even think many of them would even understand what that would mean if you applied that to their work, because it's simply not conscious.
I mean, a book I read very much in this vein, it's not a brilliant book, it's by no means the best of its type, but Phil Kelly's Farsight Crisis of Faith, I thought, has... I mean, it's strongly utopian in the way that it depicts this particular faction in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. The whole conception of the Tau is strongly utopian.
It's strongly utopian, isn't it? They were designed...
is definitely there in the background.
Totally, yeah, and they are designed, aren't they, as a contrast to the pervasive dystopianism of the rest of the setting.
Even in their youngness, that's a sort of key feature of them. I mean, Warhammer 40,000, the very title of it suggests everything is ancient, old, decrepit, falling apart, and then you have this one faction that's defined by its youthfulness and its energy.
Yes, I mean, dynamically they are antithetical to the Necrons, of course, which I believe they were originally designed to counter, at least in terms of their ethos. Yeah, absolutely.
And you even more incidentally, you'll get D&D settings that are clearly utopian.
Clearly utopian. There are certain cities and even realms in the D&D setting that, without realizing it, are entirely utopian. In fact, many of the worlds that dungeon masters incidentally create, like the towns, the cities and whatnot, operate on utopian ideals or along utopian lines. They just don't realize that that's the case.
And it's a brilliant setup for that kind of imaginative act, because you're thinking, I'm creating all of these different societies, maybe one of them I want to be ideal, what elements do I want to put into this? And it creates that. It almost goes back to the very origins of the genre and just imagining, well, what would you do to create social harmony? How do you handle justice? How do you handle economy? It's a fascinating stylistic exercise.
It really is, isn't it? I mean, it's something I probably haven't considered before, although I'm enjoying playing D&D immensely at the moment as a dungeon master. But yes, as an imaginative exercise, especially if you're creating your settings from the foundations up, these are things that you are necessarily going to have to consider. How does my society work? What lines does it function? What is law here? What is religion? What is currency? Yeah, it's fascinating.
I mean, and I think that shows. I mean, there's a sort of there's a tradition in the left of thinking about utopia and thinking about it, because I tend to focus on the genre as a historical phenomena, going back to Moore and seeing antecedents to that. There's a sort of another tradition that's emerged on the left, talking about the utopian imagination as a more timeless feature of just human being.
Yes, it's almost innate.
Yeah, that we think counterfactually about possible futures, and that we have this striving to build better societies and to imagine society in this way. I mean, that too could, I'm sure some anthropologists could argue that that's also historically grounded, that isn't a universal feature of all societies, that some societies don't feature that kind of, that there's no scope within their society perhaps to imagine society being built in that way, being constructed in that way. But it's an interesting way to consider, and it certainly expands it far beyond the utopian genre, and also gives a sense of hope to the utopian genre being itself timeless. That once someone like Moore has done something like that, that his example will probably be returned to during these stress points, and during points where people feel left behind by the inadequacies of previous utopianisms.
Absolutely, yes. Brilliance. Absolute brilliance. I think that's a good note to close on, Rowan. What say you?
Yeah, that's really
fabulous. Brilliant stuff. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed our conversation here. Thank you so much, Rowan, for coming on. It's been a pleasure. It's been an absolute pleasure. I hope you'll come on again.
Absolutely, I'd love to.
Brilliant. Maybe next time what we'll do is we'll set out a subject.
Yeah, it's great to do a sort of freewheeling conversation, but there's a chance of running out of.
Absolutely, and there's a chance of anything else just running out of time, because one subject necessarily leads on to another, and so on and so forth. But thank you once again. Is there anything that you would like to pimp out, to talk about to our listeners out there?
If people are interested in utopianism, I'm doing a blog series on Medium right now called Writing Utopia. I could pass the link on to you.
Absolutely. Links down below, ladies and gents.
And I've written a timeline of Utopia, which I used a little bit during this conversation.
It's a Sunday afternoon. It's fine. I don't think anyone's on full throttle.
I'm moving right now, so I'm just a short distance, but everything in boxes, including my own mind, it seems. So.
Compartmentalized. Everything is sealed away where it belongs, not to be accessed.
Until the move, hopefully it'll turn up again in one of those boxes.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Bye-bye, ladies and gentlemen.
Mm-hmm.